I just wanted to give a quick overview of the teaching that I'm excited about doing this semester. So that's what I'm going to talk through in this video. There isn't really a theme to my teaching this semester, but if there is one, like reflecting on the courses that I'm teaching, I realised they're actually quite close to the idea of a book that I recently had come out, an edited collection that's about stories and storytelling. That is, a lot of my courses this semester are thinking about what a story means and what happens when you take a story from one place and you put it into another place, how you reshape the meaning of it through that kind of cultural shift, but also the kind of language and the form that it takes, how that works for your new audience. So let's just see what those different courses are. The first one starts with the place that I almost always start from, which is the Beowulf manuscript, the single medieval copy, medieval edition if you like, of the poem Beowulf. Here it is opening with its famous word "what," calling attention to the story that it's going to tell. But it's not actually the Beowulf poem or the manuscript that we're going to look at, that I'm going to look at this semester. It's various different translations of it. The idea for this course actually came from the release of this edition, this new translation by a writer called Maria Devana Headley, whose work I love, and she translated Beowulf in a brilliantly new, vibrant, exciting way fairly recently. And I automatically wanted to compare that with Seamus Heaney's translation of Beowulf. Heaney, a very famous Irish poet who won the Nobel Prize and won a huge number of prizes for this particular production that he made, this translation of Beowulf, into his distinctive voice for poetry. Comparing those translations, these two poetic ones, very literary ones if you like, with these two, the Rob Fulk translation that I tend to use in my teaching when I'm teaching the poem, and a Michael Swanson one, which I really like and I feel very affectionate about because it's the one that I used when I was an undergraduate, and comparing those with Tolkien's quite rough translation, which is the one that he used in his lecture notes, I think will be an awful lot of fun to see the different ways in which these writers engage with the poem and with its language, and the different impressions that we get of the monsters and of the hero as we're working through those ideas. But I also wanted to look, I had to draw the line somewhere and limit things somewhere, but I really wanted to look at some older translations. This one here, this beautiful thing, is a very early translation indeed by a guy called William Morris, who you might perhaps have heard of. He's more famous for kind of arts and crafts type movement, hence the printing of this, and his translation is fairly linguistically loose, but we're not thinking about these pieces of work as in terms of how close they are to that manuscript that I showed you of the poem. I'm interested in thinking about what they do with the poem, what it means for them. And in that context, I'm perhaps especially excited about reading this version, a German translation by a guy called Hugo Gehring, which I've dipped in and out of every so often, but my German isn't particularly good, so I'm very excited about reading that with you guys this semester. So that's a course on translating Beowulf, which I've called From Low to Bro, the idea being that opening words, how you open the poem, sets the tone for the whole thing. Is it an ancient, dignified, Germanic story, low, or is it like an immediate thing that's happening right here and now, as it is in Devana Headley's version, bro, where you get straight into it, and everything in between. So that's the, again, it's not about teaching Beowulf, the poem, as an early medieval piece of work. It's about engaging with, exploring, experiencing what Beowulf means for these various different writers in their different contexts and how they communicate them. I have to say that I'm really very excited about that course. I'm excited about seeing what comes out of it. I've not done this kind of thing before. I've used each of these translations in various different ways, but I've never sat down and closely compared them with one another, so I can't wait to see what you guys are going to tell me about them. That course is for masters and for advanced students, so we'll think a lot about translation and how that works. Another course that's thinking about translation, and is also for masters and advanced students, is this one, where we'll start off with a story that many of you I think will know, which is the story of Judith. It's a magnificent Jewish heroine who murders the Assyrian general Holofernes in his own bed with his own sword. So she's this glorious but also quite disturbing heroic figure, and there's a famous, wonderful, quite short Old English poem about her, which is actually in the same manuscript as the Beowulf poem, and we'll have a look at the way in which the poet works with scriptural source to change both the character of Judith and the character of Holofernes, whom she opposes, the way in which she is turned into a very specific kind of hero, I think, in my reading. And then we'll get on to a huge celebrity superstar saint, who I guess many of you won't have heard of, but in the period that we're studying she was super famous, and that's this woman here, Saint Helena, or in Old English Elena. So Helena or Elena, who is the mother of Constantine, the Roman emperor, who converted the Roman Empire, if you like, to Christianity. And what she's particularly famous for is that she found, or was believed to have found, to have rediscovered the cross on which Jesus was crucified. So that's what's happening in this scene. And the Old English poem about her makes her into a kind of extraordinary, eloquent, powerful leader of people who uses her words and her self-control and her intelligence to take over a situation, and in fact to perform a very significant conversion of a particular individual. There's loads in this poem that we'll want to explore, including a lot of anti-Semitism, a lot of violent language that's really quite disturbing and quite unsettling, but also lots of female heroism in the same way as there is in Judith. So we'll explore the ways in which these writers, an anonymous writer here, a guy called Cunewulf here, work with their sources and convert their sources into Old English poetry. Now, the last text we'll look at, I'm astonished to find that it's really difficult. I say really difficult, I mean about half an hour of Google image searching doesn't get it for me. It's really difficult to find an image of this story, which is crazy because the story is extraordinary. It's not a poem that's very often taught, or that I don't teach it very often, because it's quite a long Old English poem, and it's quite a strange, quite a difficult Old English poem. It's another translation, it's another thing that, like Elena and like Judith, is working with a Latin source and turning that into Old English poetry. And this poem is called Andreas, and it's about the life or the adventures of Saint Andrew, one of Jesus' followers. After Jesus is dead, Andreas in the Old English version, goes and travels to a city in a place called Myrmidonia, where the people are cannibals, and they use a terrifying potion to drug their victims, and then they cook them and they eat them. And Andreas is there to end this terrible practice and to convert them, to bring them to Christianity. And he's really quite a reluctant hero. He doesn't want to do it. And one of the interesting and difficult things about the poem is working out, is it meant to be funny? Because it is funny, and how do we deal with that? So we're going to see quite different uses of Old English poetry in these three texts. The kind of thrusting heroic power of Judith that's also very tightly tied up with her femininity, and for the poet, her virginity. The kind of noble, powerful eloquence of the leader Elena in Cunewulf's poem, and the possibly comic, certainly exciting and physicalised and grotesque heroic poetry of Andreas. So we'll be thinking about these different heroes, about the different ways in which they're heroic or not heroic, and the different ways in which the poetry works to communicate those ideas. So I think that'll be an awful lot of fun. I'm very excited about teaching Andreas. The next course that I'm teaching is going to be working with these 4 different manuscripts and a few others as well. This is the Bartes module that I'm teaching twice this semester. So I've got 2 different classes, one on Monday and one on Wednesday. And this is the Middle English part of the basic module. We're going to start with this manuscript here, which is a poem called The Owl and the Nightingale. You might perhaps be able to read them there, and Hula and Hornichtingala. So we'll read about them, we'll work with a manuscript, we'll translate parts of the poem, and then we'll think about the poem and how it functioned in its own cultural context. And then we'll move down here to this manuscript, which is both the manuscript and the text it contains are called the Book of Margery Kempe. And you will learn all about Margery Kempe, what kind of person she was, or how she presents herself, because this is that rarest of things, which is a medieval autobiography, or so it poses as being, her words dictated to somebody who wrote them down for her. So we'll be thinking about this manuscript, which is obviously quite different looking from most of the manuscripts that we've looked at in the basic module in the winter semester. Much rougher, much tighter, much cheaper. And we'll be thinking about her as a woman, and her as somebody who has intense religious experiences and goes on pilgrimages, travelling all over Western Europe and down to Jerusalem as part of her engagement with God and with the communities in which she lived. And then we'll move finally onto this manuscript, which is one of the most famous manuscripts of one of the most famous medieval poems. It's called the Ellesmere manuscript, and it's a copy of Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, and we'll luxuriate in the beauty of it, but we'll also enjoy the kind of the funny, the ironic, the silly, the playful, the thoughtful nature of Chaucer's poetry, the way in which he writes about different people's social status in 14th century, late 14th century England. And then finally, we'll move on to thinking about the end of the medieval period. This is not a manuscript, this is a printed book. the first book to be printed in Middle English by a guy called William Caxton. So we'll fairly briefly consider what the introduction of print meant for Middle English, what it meant for the medieval period, and how, in some sense, we can see print and the standardisation that it brings about as bringing an end to lots of the big movements that we've been talking about throughout the basic module. So I'm really looking forward to another semester of working on manuscripts and on language and on interpretation with you all. And then the first of my intermediate courses is like one of those translation courses. It's focused on saints. We're going to read 4 different saints' lives. They're quite different. I've chosen to try to be quite different from one another. Our first saint is here, Saint Eugenia, who I'm quite frustrated, to be honest, by how limited the illustrations I can find of her are. She is one of the transvestite saints. That is a female saint who dresses up as a man and who works as a man for quite some time. There's a dramatic revelation scene with her father. She goes on various different adventures, and she does quite a lot of different things. She's a very interesting figure. So we'll think about the nature of her gendered performance, the extent to which her body and the way in which her body is regarded define or don't define her. We're thinking about her as a child in relation to her parents, and so on and so forth. Now we'll move on to this guy here. He is St. Basil, who was a very learned man and a great kind of leader and establisher of the early church, establisher of a monastic order. So we'll think about the idea of learning and of writing and of authority and what those different things mean, and the extent to which Christianity as a religious system subverts, goes against other systems of authority, and what it reveals about the nature of power and how that kind of functions in different ways in different places. Then we move on to this guy. This technique of illustrating him as a kind of gay icon is later than the text that we'll be looking at, but it's nonetheless a fascinating part of his story. This is Saint Sebastian, who is a soldier saint. So we have a transvestite saint, and we have a kind of learned saint, a patriarch saint we could call him, and we have a soldier saint. Sebastian, who is a great soldier, a great warrior, but like somebody like St. Martin, his greatest warriorship is to turn himself to Christ and to work for the religion of Christianity. He is martyred in the way that you can see there, though the kind of sexy nature of what you can see there is not at all part of the text that we'll be looking at. So we'll be thinking about this idea of imprisonment, of torture and of violence, and of how that functions, and to some extent we'll be thinking about the gendered worlds, Sebastian's masculinity, and how he interacts with various different people as part of that, particularly how he interacts with women. And the last text we'll read is about these guys, another group of men. These are the 40 soldiers who are martyred by being thrust into a big cold bath together, which is quite an odd little story. So we'll be thinking again about military behaviour and life and comradeship and brotherhood and all the things that brings with it, and the extent to which that does and does not map on to Christian ideas. So yeah, to some extent that brings together some of the other ideas we'll think about through this course, about to what extent one can be an individual, an unusual, isolated, self-actualised person within a Christian or a social framework, and to what extent one has to conform to part of what's going on in a wider social grouping as part of being a Christian. So the extent to which sanctity, sainthood in this period, in our Old English texts, is something that enables us to break out of expectations, and the extent to which it imposes expectations upon us. But throughout all of this, all these different saintly figures, we're only going to look at them in one particular person's writing. This is not him, despite the kind of fanfare with which I've introduced him, because I don't have a contemporary picture of him. This is just a picture of a scribe from the Old English period. These are all going to be versions of saints' lives written by Alfred of Evesham, so we can think about specifically the context in which Alfred is writing and Alfred's own ideas about these saints. So we're going to think about the saints and what they might mean for various different people, what their stories mean. We're going to think specifically about what these saints mean for Alfred, what he tries to do with their stories, how he tries to make their stories into something relevant and useful and productive for him in the context in which he's writing. And because this is a Methoden module, a methods module, we're also going to think about your writing, about what it looks like for you to write effectively about these ideas of history and of sanctity and of authorship and of translation all at the same time. So we're trying to attack quite a lot of different things there, which I hope should be fun. Okay. And then another of my courses is going to be the first time I've ever taught Tolkien, and along with Tolkien, and I teach various other things as well. We're going to move from Tolkien's vision of creation, imagination of creation in the Silmarillion, the kind of, in some senses, the kind of prequel, if you like, to the Lord of the Rings. That's not really what it is, but that's how it's most famous. And then we'll move on to what is actually my favourite Discworld novel, which is Small Gods, which is an amazing story about belief and gods, and how religion is and is not a normative force. And then we'll have a little break, mostly just to enjoy Monty Python and the Holy Grail, because there's always time to enjoy Monty Python and the Holy Grail. But we'll also think a little bit about the way in which that thinks about God and religion, and how that kind of functions in the crazy, anarchic, comic, silly world of Monty Python. And then we'll move on in the kind of second half of the course. We'll move on to Wizard of Earthsea, which is a classic work of fantasy, which you may or may not have read, which I think is just incredible. And one of the things that I want to explore there is the idea of plurality and individuality, the extent to which being an individual means being a plurality of different things versus being an individual, a single, isolated, unitary individual, related to the ideas that are explored, I think, in the Silmarillion and in Small Gods, about the extent to which God is an individual, is a single unitary figure, a monotheistic figure, we might say, or a plural of various different divinities. And those same ideas are explored in a whole long sequence of books that start off with this one called The Assassin's Apprentice, the first in the Farseer trilogy, which becomes a whole kind of many books, about kind of 15 books I think there are in total. We're not going to read all of them, though I would be delighted to talk about them all if you like. But we are going to think about the same kind of ideas about plurality and individuality, both at a divine level, the various different gods that are invoked, that are explored in Robin Hobb's books, but also at a kind of national level, the extent to which plurality and individuality in kingdoms and in rulership is an ideal or something problematic in those texts, and in terms of individual identities, that in the same way as Le Guin, Robin Hobb is really interested in the idea of the extent to which an individual is a unitary being, is a clearly defined and bonded thing, or whether individuals bleed into one another and we are only complete if we are connected with others. So there's quite a lot of questions I want to explore, and we're using these four main texts with a bit of a bonus of Monty Python to explore these questions. What I'm hoping in this course is that you'll be able to bring your own experiences of other fantasy fiction and other medievalist fiction, other fiction that uses a roughly medieval setting as a kind of playground to explore ideas. So we're going to try and think about why this world is so attractive to writers, this kind of medieval world as a place in which you can allow ideas to play and explore. We're going to think about the idea of the divine, what it means to have a plural set of gods versus a monotheistic god in these worlds of fantasy, why plural gods seem so appealing to modern writers of fantasy fiction, and we're also going to think about how that relates to selfhood, the extent to which individuals are plurals or not. In kind of philosophical, theoretical terms, that kind of idea. And that's on Thursday afternoons. So I'm really looking forward to that course, which, a bit like the Translations of Beowulf course, is a bit experimental for me. So I'm quite excited about it. And that's an intermediate course that I'm doing. If you want to contact me to ask questions about any of these courses or to explore them in more detail, please feel free to do so. You can email me, you can contact me on Rocket Chat or on Discord, or you can book an office hour using that shortcut to the Google Doc. So I look forward to hearing from you, and far more than that, I'm really excited about talking about all of these different stories with you over the next few months. Bye.